The morning Thomas Whitmore died, a 12-year-old boy named Samuel stood at the foot of the master's bed and smiled. Not a fleeting smirk or a nervous twitch of the lips, but a full, genuine smile that reached his dark eyes and stayed there, unwavering, as the plantation owner took his final rattling breath. The room was thick with the smell of sickness and sweat, the Alabama heat already pressing through the windows, despite the early hour. Mrs. Whitmore clutched her husband's hand, her face buried in the quilted bedspread, her shoulders shaking with sobs. The doctor stood by the window, closing his leather bag with a quiet click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence, and Samuel smiled. No one noticed at first. The house slaves who had been summoned to the death chamber kept their eyes down, as they had learned to do over years of servitude on the Whitmore plantation. They stood along the wall like shadows, waiting for instructions, for the widow's grief to transform into orders. But Samuel stood different. He had been called in specifically because Thomas Whitmore had asked for him in his final moments, a request that had surprised everyone, including Samuel himself. The boy had worked in the field since he was 7, his small hands learning to pick cotton under the merciless sun that burned across the vast acreage of the Whitmore estate, one of the largest plantations in Monroe County. Samuel had never been inside the master's bedroom before. He had rarely been inside the main house at all. His world was the quarters, the fields, the dirt paths between the rows of cotton that stretched toward the horizon. Yet here he stood, on polished wooden floors, surrounded by furniture that cost more than the combined value of every person who looked like him on this property. And he smiled as Thomas Whitmore's chest stopped rising, as the man's fingers went slack in his wife's grip. As death claimed the master who had owned Samuel since birth, it was Margaret, the head house servant, who noticed first. Her eyes, trained to observe everything in silence, caught the expression on Samuel's face. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew what that smile could mean for the boy. She knew what happened to slaves who showed anything other than sorrow at a master's passing. She had seen men whipped for less, sold away for smaller infractions. Her hand moved slightly, a subtle gesture meant to catch Samuel's attention, to warn him, but the boy's gaze remained fixed on the still form in the bed, and the smile never wavered. Mrs. Whitmore lifted her head, her face red and wet with tears. Her eyes swept the room, taking in the assembled slaves, landing finally on Samuel. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable through her grief. Then she looked away, turning back to her husband's body. She had seen the smile, too. Everyone in that room had seen it, but no one said a word. The funeral was held 3 days later on a Thursday afternoon, when the sun sat heavy and white in the sky, turning the air into something thick enough to choke on. The entire plantation gathered in the family cemetery, a small plot surrounded by iron fencing on a hill that overlooked the cotton fields. Thomas Whitmore's coffin was made of polished mahogany, carried by 6 house servants in their finest clothes, which still looked shabby next to the mourning attire of the white families, who had traveled from neighboring plantations to pay their respects. Samuel stood at the back with the other field workers, all of them scrubbed as clean as possible, wearing whatever passed for decent among people who owned nothing. The preacher spoke about Thomas Whitmore's generosity, his business acumen, his love for his family and his land. He painted a picture of a good Christian man, a pillar of the community, a provider who had built something lasting. Samuel listened to every word, his face carefully blank now, the smile gone. He had learned quickly after that morning in the bedroom. Margaret had pulled him aside the moment they were dismissed, her fingers tight on his arm, her voice urgent and low. "You keep that face hidden, boy," she had hissed. "You understand me? Whatever you feeling, whatever you thinking, you lock it down deep where nobody can see it. That smile gonna get you killed." Samuel had nodded, but he hadn't explained. How could he explain something he didn't fully understand himself? The smile had come unbidden, rising from somewhere deep inside him that he had never accessed before. It wasn't joy exactly, though there was something light in it. It wasn't relief, though he had felt his shoulders ease as he watched the master die. It was something else, something he had no words for, something that felt like a door opening in a room he had always believed had no exit. Now, standing in the cemetery heat, watching Mrs. Whitmore weep into a black lace handkerchief, while her 2 grown sons stood stoic beside her, Samuel kept his expression neutral. He watched the coffin being lowered into the red Alabama earth. He watched the white people file past to offer condolences. He watched the overseer, a thin, cruel man named Vernon Pike, scan the assembled slaves with his pale eyes, looking for any sign of disrespect, any excuse to use the whip that hung coiled at his belt. The services ended as the sun began its descent, painting the sky orange and purple. The white families returned to their carriages, the house slaves went back to preparing food for the reception, and the field workers, Samuel among them, walked the long path back to the quarters, their shadows stretching long and dark across the land that had never belonged to them, that would never belong to them, no matter how much of their blood and sweat soaked into it. Life on the Whitmore plantation had always followed a rhythm as predictable as the seasons, but Thomas Whitmore's death disrupted that rhythm in ways both subtle and profound. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, now the widow, took control of the estate with a firmness that surprised many who had assumed she would retreat into her grief and leave the management to her eldest son, Jonathan. But Eleanor had grown up on a plantation, had married into another, and knew the cotton business as well as any man. She began appearing at the fields each morning, riding a chestnut mare, watching the work with eyes that missed nothing. Samuel noticed her watching him specifically. It started the week after the funeral, a feeling of being observed that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He would be in the middle of a row, his fingers working mechanically through the cotton bolls, and he would look up to find her there on her horse, her black mourning dress stark against the green of the plants. Their eyes would meet for a moment, before she would turn away, moving on to inspect another section. But it kept happening, day after day, until Samuel began to feel like a specimen under examination. The other slaves noticed, too. In the quarters at night, people spoke in hushed voices about the widow's strange interest in the boy. Some thought she planned to have him punished for the smile that had spread through the plantation in whispered conversations. Others believed she planned to sell him, to remove the reminder of whatever disrespect she had perceived. Samuel's mother, Ruth, a woman worn thin by years of fieldwork and heartbreak, held him close those nights and prayed in words too soft for him to hear. But nothing happened. Days turned into weeks and the harvest continued. September arrived with its urgent push to get the cotton in before the weather turned. Every available hand worked from dawn until well past dark, the white fluff piling into baskets, into wagons, into the massive cotton house where it waited to be ginned and pressed into bales. Samuel's hands bled from the work, the sharp edges of the bowls cutting into fingers that had never been soft but were now raw meat wrapped in skin. He worked without complaint, as they all did, because complaint meant the whip or worse. It was during this intensive harvest period that Samuel first spoke to Eleanor Whitmore directly. He had been sent to the main house to deliver a message from the overseer about supplies needed in the fields. Margaret met him at the kitchen door, took the message, and told him to wait. But instead of Margaret returning, it was Mrs. Whitmore herself who appeared in the doorway, the folded paper in her hand, her eyes fixed on Samuel with an intensity that made him want to run. "You're Samuel," she said. It wasn't a question. "You were there when my husband died." "Yes, ma'am," Samuel said, eyes down, heart pounding. "Look at me, boy." He raised his eyes slowly, meeting her gaze. She studied his face for a long moment, and he wondered if she could see it. The smile that lived inside him still hidden but not gone. Eleanor Whitmore did something unexpected that day on the kitchen steps. She asked Samuel a question that no white person had ever asked him before, a question that treated him like someone whose thoughts might matter. "Did you hate him?" she asked, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "My husband. Did you hate Thomas?" Samuel stood frozen, his mind racing through possible answers and their consequences. To say yes would be admitting to feelings that could get him killed. To say no would be a lie so obvious that it might insult her intelligence. He chose a third path, one that was neither agreement nor denial. "I don't know what hate is, ma'am," he said carefully. "Never been allowed to feel it long enough to know." Something flickered across Eleanor's face, an expression Samuel couldn't read. She looked at him for another long moment, then nodded once, sharply, and dismissed him with a wave of her hand. He walked back to the fields, with his pulse still racing, certain that he had just made a terrible mistake, that his honesty would cost him everything. But again, nothing happened. The days continued their relentless march toward winter. What Samuel didn't know was that his answer had lodged itself in Eleanor's mind like a splinter. She found herself thinking about it at odd moments, during meals, during her evening reading, during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come and she lay in the bed where Thomas had died. The boy's words had revealed something she had spent her entire life avoiding thinking about, a truth that lived underneath the foundation of everything she knew. These people who worked her land, who raised her food, who cleaned her house, they weren't allowed to feel. Or rather, they felt everything but were permitted to show nothing, to express nothing, to be nothing but labor and obedience. She began to pay closer attention to the slaves around her, really looking at them for the first time in her 53 years. She saw how Margaret's hands trembled sometimes when serving tea, how the stable boy named Jacob flinched when anyone moved too quickly near him, how the old man called Moses, who tended the gardens, sang songs that sounded joyful, but had words about crossing rivers and finding freedom. She saw the elaborate performance of contentment that every enslaved person on her property maintained every moment of every day, and she began to understand what an exhausting act it must be. Her interest in Samuel intensified. She learned from the overseer that the boy was considered bright, that he picked up tasks quickly, that he caused no trouble. She learned from Margaret that his mother Ruth had been bought by Thomas 15 years ago, that Samuel's father had been sold away before the boy was born, that Ruth had lost 2 other children to sickness. These facts, which would have been merely property records to her a month ago, now felt weighted with significance that made Eleanor uncomfortable in ways she couldn't fully articulate. The autumn deepened, bringing cooler nights and the smell of wood smoke from the quarters. The cotton harvest was nearly complete, and soon the plantation would shift into its winter rhythms. Winter settled over Monroe County, with a gentleness that belied the harshness of life beneath its mild temperatures. The cotton had been sold, the profits calculated, and the plantation entered its slower season when the field slaves turned their attention to repairs, clearing land and preparing for the next planting. Samuel had turned 13 in November, though no one celebrated the date or marked it in any official way. His mother had simply told him one morning that he was a year older, and he had nodded and gone about his work. Eleanor Whitmore made a decision in December that sent ripples of confusion through the plantation hierarchy. She informed Vernon Pike, the overseer, that Samuel was to be trained for housework. Pike had objected strenuously, arguing that the boy was young and strong and would be wasted on domestic duties when he could be producing in the fields. But Eleanor was firm in a way that left no room for argument, and Pike had no choice but to comply, though his resentment showed in the hard set of his jaw and the way his hand kept moving to the whip at his belt. Margaret received Samuel into the house with a mixture of concern and curiosity. She had been watching the widow's fixation on the boy with growing unease, uncertain of what it meant or where it might lead. "You keep your head down and your mouth shut," she instructed Samuel on his first day. "You do exactly what you're told, nothing more and nothing less, and for the love of God, you keep whatever thoughts you have locked up tight." Samuel proved to be an apt pupil in the ways of house service. He learned quickly how to set a table properly, how to serve without being intrusive, how to move through rooms as if he were invisible. He learned the particular preferences of the Whitmore family, which son liked his coffee with cream, which daughter-in-law required her bath water at a specific temperature. He absorbed the elaborate etiquette of a world that existed in stark contrast to the quarters where he still slept each night, walking the distance between 2 universes every dawn and dusk. But the real education was in observation. Working in the house gave Samuel access to conversations and interactions he had never witnessed before. He stood in corners while the Whitmore sons argued with their mother about the management of the plantation. Jonathan, the eldest, believed his mother was too lenient with the slaves and pushed for harsher discipline and longer working hours. Charles, 2 years younger, cared only about the money the plantation generated and whether it would be enough to fund his lifestyle in Mobile, where he preferred to spend his time. Eleanor listened to both with a patience that seemed to cost her something, her face aging perceptibly during these exchanges. Samuel also witnessed moments of startling intimacy. He saw Eleanor weep alone in Thomas's study, holding one of her husband's jackets to her face. He saw her tender with her grandchildren when they visited, a softness in her that disappeared the moment the children left. He saw her stare out windows for long stretches, her face carrying an expression of deep uncertainty, as if she were struggling with questions that had no easy answers. One evening in January, as Samuel was clearing away the dinner dishes, Eleanor spoke to him again. The family had departed and she sat alone at the long dining table, a glass of port wine in her hand. "Samuel," she said, and he stopped, standing at attention as he had been taught. "I want you to tell me about your mother, about Ruth." The request was so unexpected that Samuel hesitated, unsure if this was a test or a trap. But Eleanor's face showed genuine interest, even something like concern, so he spoke carefully. "She works hard, Mom. She's strong. She sings sometimes, in the evenings." "What does she sing about?" "About rivers, mostly. About crossing over, about rest." Eleanor nodded slowly, and Samuel saw something complicated move across her features. "Does she ever talk about your father?" "No, Ma'am, she doesn't speak of him." "Do you remember him?" "No, Ma'am. He was sold before I have memory." The word sold hung in the air between them, stark and ugly. Eleanor took a long drink of her wine, and Samuel stood waiting, uncertain if he was dismissed or if more was coming. Finally, she waved her hand, and he gathered the dishes and retreated to the kitchen, leaving her alone with whatever thoughts occupied her mind. The winter progressed, and Samuel's position in the house became established. The other slaves watched this development with mixed feelings. Some saw it as good fortune and escape from the brutal field work. Others saw it as dangerous proximity to white power, a situation where one misstep could be catastrophic. Samuel's mother worried constantly but said little, knowing that neither she nor Samuel had any control over the decisions made about their lives. February brought rain that turned the red Alabama earth to thick mud and kept people inside more than usual. The plantation felt smaller during these wet weeks, the world contracting to the spaces under roofs and the short dashes between buildings. Samuel had been working in the main house for nearly 3 months, and he had developed a reputation for being reliable and unobtrusive, qualities that made him valuable in the delicate ecosystem of domestic service. It was during one of these rainy afternoons that Samuel discovered something that would change the trajectory of his life in ways he couldn't have anticipated. He had been sent to Thomas Whitmore's study to dust and organize, a task that Eleanor had recently allowed him to handle. The room remained largely as the master had left it, a shrine to his memory filled with ledgers, books, and the accumulated papers of a man who had run a substantial business enterprise. Samuel worked methodically, careful not to disturb anything important. But as he reached to dust a high shelf, his hand knocked against a book that fell open on the desk, its pages revealing handwritten text. Samuel couldn't read, had never been taught, but something about the careful formation of the letters drew his attention. He stared at the marks on the page, feeling a deep frustration at his inability to decode them, to access whatever knowledge or story they contained. Eleanor found him like that, standing over the open book with an expression of intense concentration. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to make him jump. "I'm sorry, Ma'am, I knocked it down by accident," Samuel said quickly, moving to close the book. "Stop," Eleanor said, stepping into the room. She approached the desk and looked down at the book, then at Samuel's face. "You can't read, can you?" "No, ma'am." "Do you want to learn?" The question struck Samuel like a physical blow. Want was not a word that applied to people like him. Want was a luxury afforded only to those who had choices. He stared at Eleanor, trying to determine if this was another test, another opportunity to incriminate himself. The tension stretched between them until Eleanor sat down in her husband's chair with a heavy sigh. "It's illegal, you know," she said quietly. "Teaching slaves to read, against the law in Alabama, and has been for years. If anyone discovered I was doing it, there would be consequences." She paused, looking at the book on the desk. "But Thomas kept so many secrets from me, made so many decisions without my input. Perhaps I'm entitled to a secret of my own." Samuel didn't dare speak, didn't dare hope that she meant what he thought she meant. Eleanor looked up at him, and he saw in her face the same complicated expression he had seen several times now, something torn and struggling. "If I taught you," she said, "you would have to be absolutely careful. No one could know, not Margaret, not your mother, not any of the other slaves, certainly not my sons or Vernon Pike. Do you understand what I'm saying? The danger?" "Yes, ma'am," Samuel managed to say through the tightness in his throat. "And you would have to be patient. It would take time, and we could only work when the house was empty, when there was no risk of discovery." "Yes, ma'am," Eleanor nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "Then we'll begin tomorrow. Same time, when the rain is keeping everyone occupied elsewhere." She stood and moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "That smile," she said, "the one you had when Thomas died. I've spent months trying to understand it. I think I'm beginning to." She left before Samuel could respond, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Samuel stood in the study, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. He looked down at the book on the desk, at the mysterious symbols that might soon transform from meaningless marks into meaning, into power, into a kind of freedom that existed in the mind even when the body was bound. The lessons began the next day, as promised. Eleanor started with the alphabet, teaching Samuel the shapes and sounds of each letter. He proved to be a remarkably quick student, his mind hungry for this knowledge that had been deliberately withheld from him his entire life. Within weeks, he could recognize simple words. Within 2 months, he was reading basic sentences. Eleanor brought him books from Thomas's collection, starting with simple texts and gradually increasing in complexity. During these clandestine sessions, Eleanor also talked. She spoke about her own life, about being married at 17 to a man she barely knew, about learning to manage a household and a business while having no legal rights to either. She spoke about her children, her disappointments, and her fears for their futures. And sometimes she spoke about slavery itself, grappling aloud with questions that clearly troubled her deeply. "I was taught that this was natural," she said one afternoon as Samuel worked through a passage from the Bible, "that your people were meant for this, that it was God's design. But watching you learn, seeing how quickly your mind works, it makes me question everything I was told." Samuel didn't respond. He had learned that these moments were Eleanor thinking aloud, wrestling with her conscience, and that his role was simply to be present, to be the evidence that contradicted her lifetime of conditioning. Spring came to the plantation with its usual explosion of green, the world renewing itself with an indifference to human suffering that Samuel found almost beautiful in its consistency. He was 13 now, taller than he had been in the winter, his body beginning the transformation toward manhood. He had been reading for 4 months, and the world had cracked open in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. Every book Eleanor gave him revealed new possibilities, new ways of thinking, new evidence that the story he had been told about himself and his people was a lie constructed to justify an economic system built on human misery. He read the Bible and saw passages about freedom and dignity that were never quoted in the sermons preached to slaves. 1. He read histories and learned about civilizations in Africa that had flourished while Europe was in darkness. He read philosophy and encountered arguments about natural rights and human equality that contradicted everything the plantation system claimed to be true. Each revelation was a small revolution in his mind, and he understood now why teaching slaves to read was illegal. Literacy was dangerous because it made lies visible. But the lessons had another consequence Samuel hadn't anticipated. They created a relationship between him and Eleanor that neither of them quite knew how to navigate. She was still his owner, still the person who controlled every aspect of his existence with the power of law and custom behind her. But she was also, in some strange way, becoming something like a teacher, a guide, someone invested in his intellectual development. The contradiction was impossible to resolve, and both of them felt it during their sessions in the study. One afternoon in April, Jonathan Whitmore nearly discovered them. He arrived at the house unexpectedly from his own property in the next county, entering through the front door just as Eleanor and Samuel were deep in a lesson on grammar. They heard his voice calling for his mother, and Eleanor's face went white with panic. She shoved the book into a drawer and whispered urgently for Samuel to start dusting. By the time Jonathan entered the study, Samuel was running a cloth over the shelves, while Eleanor sat at the desk examining what appeared to be household accounts. "Mother," Jonathan said, his eyes moving suspiciously between Eleanor and Samuel. "What's going on here?" "I'm reviewing expenses," Eleanor replied calmly, though Samuel could see her hands trembling slightly. "And having the study cleaned. Is there something you need?" Jonathan looked at Samuel with undisguised hostility. He had never liked his mother's decision to bring the boy into the house, seeing it as an unnecessary indulgence that disrupted the natural order. "I need to discuss the planting schedule with you alone." Samuel was dismissed and retreated to the kitchen, where Margaret looked at him with knowing eyes. "You're playing a dangerous game, boy," she said quietly. "Whatever's happening between you and the mistress, it won't end well. It can't." Samuel wanted to tell her she was wrong, but he knew she wasn't. There was no version of this story where he and Eleanor could continue indefinitely, where the secret could be kept forever, where the fundamental impossibility of their situation could be overcome. Alabama in 1855 had laws and customs that crushed people for far less than what they were doing, and yet he couldn't bring himself to regret it. The knowledge he had gained felt worth any price he might have to pay. That evening, back in the quarters, Samuel sat with his mother outside their small cabin. The spring air was soft, carrying the smell of turned earth and growing things. Ruth looked at her son with an expression of deep concern. "You're changing," she said. "I can see it in your eyes. Something's different." Samuel wanted to tell her everything, to share the miraculous fact that he could read, that whole worlds existed in books, that he had learned things that would astound her. But he remembered Eleanor's warnings about secrecy, about the danger, and he kept quiet. "I'm just getting older, Mama," he said. Ruth shook her head slowly. "It's more than that. You're growing in ways I can't protect you from. And it scares me, Samuel. This place, these people, they don't forgive growth in folks like us. They want us small and scared and grateful. Whatever you're becoming, you need to hide it better." Her words echoed what Margaret had said, and Samuel felt the weight of all the people who cared about him trying to make him understand the danger he was courting. But something had changed in him fundamentally, something that couldn't be reversed. The smile he had worn at Thomas Whitmore's death had been the first crack in a dam, and now that dam was breaking, floods of understanding and rage and hope pouring through him in ways he couldn't contain. The summer approached with its promise of brutal heat and endless work. The cotton would need to be planted and tended, the cycle beginning again as it had for decades, as it would for decades more unless something changed. Samuel worked his duties in the house, maintaining his careful mask of subservience, while inside his mind ranged free through territories that no chain could bind. And Eleanor continued to teach him, both of them caught in something neither fully understood, both aware that time was running out but unable to stop. Vernon Pike was watching them. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but his instincts told him something was wrong, some boundary was being violated. He began to pay closer attention to Samuel's comings and goings, to the times the boy spent in the study. The end came in July, during the height of the cotton-growing season, when the plants stood tall and green and required constant attention. Samuel had been reading for 6 months, and his skill had progressed to the point where he could tackle complex texts with minimal assistance. Eleanor had given him a book by Frederick Douglass, an autobiography that she had hidden among Thomas's papers, probably never read by her late husband. Samuel had consumed it in secret sessions, his mind reeling at the story of another enslaved person who had learned to read and had used that literacy as a pathway to freedom. The book was what gave him the courage to speak words that had been building in him for months. One afternoon, as an intense summer storm kept everyone inside and provided cover for their lesson, Samuel looked up from the page he was reading and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I need to leave this place." Eleanor's face went still and Samuel saw fear flash across it. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I can't stay here, that what you've taught me has made it impossible for me to pretend anymore, that I'd rather die trying to be free than live another 50 years as property." The words hung in the air between them, naked and dangerous. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-lashed landscape. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "You're asking me to help you run. I'm telling you that I'm going to run, whether you help me or not." Eleanor turned to face him, and Samuel saw tears on her cheeks. "Do you have any idea what they do to runaway slaves when they catch them? The torture, The mutilation. Vernon Pike would make an example of you that would haunt this plantation for generations. I know, Samuel said quietly, but I also know that staying here will kill me. Maybe not my body, but everything that makes me who I am. You've shown me that there's more to life than this. I can't unknow that. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway, heavy and deliberate. Both Eleanor and Samuel turned toward the door as it burst open, revealing Vernon Pike with Jonathan Whitmore behind him. Pike held a book in his hand, one of the texts Eleanor had been using to teach Samuel. "Found this in the boy's cabin," Pike said, his voice thick with triumph and rage. "Hidden under his mattress. Now how does a field nigger come to have a book, Mrs. Whitmore, unless someone's been breaking the law?" The silence that followed was absolute. Samuel saw Eleanor's face cycle through emotions, fear, guilt, determination, before settling into something like resolve. "I've been teaching him," she said clearly. "It was my decision, my doing." Samuel had no choice in the matter. Jonathan's face turned red with fury. "Mother, do you understand what you've done? The legal implications, the social consequences. We could lose everything." "We've already lost everything," Eleanor said quietly. "We lost it the moment we decided that owning other human beings was acceptable. I've spent the last 6 months learning what that truly means, and I won't continue to be part of it." What happened next unfolded with a terrible speed. Vernon Pike grabbed Samuel, his grip bruising on the boy's arm. Jonathan and his mother began to argue in voices that rose to shouts. Other slaves appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, Margaret among them, with her hand pressed to her mouth in horror. The storm outside intensified, thunder shaking the house's foundations. Eleanor made a decision in that moment that surprised everyone, including herself. She walked to Thomas's desk, opened a drawer and removed a small pistol that her husband had kept there. She didn't point it at anyone, but she held it in a way that made her intentions clear. "Release him, Vernon," she said. "Ma'am, you can't be serious. Release him. Now." Pike let go of Samuel's arm, stepping back with his hands raised. Jonathan stared at his mother as if seeing a stranger. "What are you doing?" he whispered. "Something I should have done long ago," Eleanor replied. She looked at Samuel, and in her eyes he saw an apology, a benediction, and a kind of desperate hope. "Run," she said. "Head north and don't stop. I'll give you as much time as I can." Samuel didn't hesitate. He bolted from the room, through the kitchen, out into the storm. Behind him he heard shouting, but he didn't look back. He ran across the muddy yard, past the slave quarters where his mother stood in a doorway with her hand outstretched toward him. He ran into the cotton fields, the rain soaking him instantly, the thunder covering the sound of his footsteps. He ran knowing that most runaways were caught, that the odds were against him, that this might be the last day of his life. But he ran anyway, carrying with him the knowledge that Eleanor had given him, the literacy that had opened his mind, and that smile, that mysterious, profound smile that had marked the beginning of his transformation. He ran toward an uncertain future, away from a certain death of the spirit. Behind him, in the study of the main house, Eleanor Whitmore stood with a smoking pistol in her hand and her son's body at her feet, having made a choice that would end her own life within the hour, one way or another, but had given Samuel the chance that every human being deserved. The storm swallowed his running figure, and the boy who had smiled at his master's death disappeared into history, one of countless thousands whose stories ended in mystery, whose fates remained unknown, whose humanity persisted despite every effort to crush it. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.